The town of Dry Creek was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that comes just before the stars bloom and after the dust settles from the last wagon down Main Street. At the edge of town, nestled beside an old windmill and a half-standing barn, was a cabin with warm light spilling from its windows. Inside, Caroline Whitlow moved through the small kitchen with muscle memory more than intention. She wore her grief quietly now, tied back in a bun, folded into letters she never sent.
A widow at 30, a midwife by trade, and alone by every other measure.
Then came the knock. Soft, hesitant but desperate. She opened the door and froze. A man stood there, dusty, gaunt, shirt clinging to him like he'd ridden hard for miles. In his arms, wrapped in a worn saddle blanket, was a baby. His voice cracked. "I heard there's a woman here who helps children." Caroline's gaze shifted to the baby's face, too pale, too quiet. She didn't ask questions. She stepped aside. "Come in." The man's name was Wyatt Ellis. He wasn't from Dry Creek. He barely looked like he was from anywhere. His boots were cracked, his hands blistered, and his eyes, they carried something shattered. He sat, unsure what to say, watching as Caroline carefully unwrapped the child. "A boy?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Colt. Is he yours?" Wyatt looked away. "He's all I got left." Caroline held the infant close, checking his breath, his lips, the coolness of his skin. "He's starving," she said. "When did he last eat?" Wyatt swallowed hard. 2 days ago. We ran out of everything." She didn't hesitate. She moved to the back room, pulled open a small cabinet, and returned with a cloth bundle and a tin. "I'll heat goat's milk. It's not perfect, but it's something." He lowered his head. "Thank you." But when the milk warmed and she tried to feed him, the baby wouldn't take it. He was too weak, too confused. Caroline paced, thinking. Then, without a word, she untied her blouse, wrapped the baby in her arms, and held him close. Wyatt blinked, stunned. "Ma'am?" "I was a mother once," she said, her voice quiet. "He needs this more than I need to remember what I lost." The cabin fell silent, save for the gentle sounds of Colt nursing and the fire popping in the hearth. Wyatt sat, hat in his lap, unable to speak. Caroline didn't expect thanks. She expected nothing. But in that small, flickering moment, the three of them formed something that didn't have a name yet. Just need. Caroline didn't sleep that night. Not fully. She kept one arm around baby Colt, his tiny body curled against her chest, fragile but breathing easier now. His skin, no longer ashen. His fists, no longer limp. He had fed just enough to stay with the world. Wyatt hadn't slept either. He sat in a wooden chair by the hearth, elbows on his knees, hands knotted together. He stared into the fire as if trying to burn away what he'd done, what he'd failed to do. At sunrise, Caroline laid the child in a straw cradle lined with quilts and stepped into the main room. She poured 2 cups of coffee. Black. No sugar. No pretense. Wyatt looked up when she handed it to him. "You don't have to stay," he said, voice gravel low. Caroline raised a brow. "He's still breathing, isn't he?" He looked down. "I don't mean just for him. I mean for me." She studied him then. Not just the wear in his clothes or the pain behind his words, but the quiet way he carried both guilt and awe. He wasn't used to being received, especially not gently. "What happened to his mother?" she asked softly. Wyatt didn't flinch. "She passed during the last snow. Fever took her fast. Too fast." Caroline nodded, not prying deeper. "I buried her on the edge of Bitterroot," he added, "under the willow tree she used to talk to." A long silence passed between them. Then Caroline whispered, "I know what it's like to hold someone who's fading." The next few days passed with a quiet rhythm. Colt cried more now, his voice returning, tiny lungs stronger. Caroline bathed him in warm water, held him close, hummed lullabies she hadn't touched in years. And Wyatt? He stayed. He fetched water from the well, split logs, fixed a broken shutter. He never asked to be needed, but he filled the empty places without meaning to. One evening, as the wind carried sage and dusk across the fields, Caroline stepped onto the porch to find Wyatt repairing the porch rail. She crossed her arms. "You planning to keep fixing things until they stop breaking?" Wyatt wiped sweat from his brow. "Seems safer than doing nothing." She smiled. "Just a little. You could leave tomorrow if you wanted. You've done more than most would." He looked at her then. "Long? Still." And said, "I don't know how to leave somewhere that finally feels like it won't give up on me." Inside, baby Colt stirred. Not from hunger, but from peace. And outside, 2 people sat quietly as the prairie stretched wide around them. Not lost. Just waiting to belong. By the time the 3rd week passed, it was no longer strange to hear Colt's soft babble filling Caroline's once quiet home. The child had put on weight, cheeks fuller, eyes brighter. He reached now, clung to fingers, recognized voices. His tiny world had begun to anchor itself. So had Wyatt. He wasn't just fixing fences anymore. He was helping with laundry, drawing water without being asked, feeding the chickens like they were his own. Caroline didn't say much about it, but every time she found her wash hung just right on the line or the fire already lit before sunrise, something in her heart shifted. She hadn't realized how used she'd become to silence, to doing it all, to being alone. One afternoon, while Colt napped, Wyatt was at the sink, drying dishes. Caroline sat near the window, peeling apples for a pie she hadn't planned to make until he offered to fetch flour that morning. "You ever been married before?" he asked, not looking up. She paused mid-peel. "Once. Jacob Whitlow. Rode freight lines for a shipping company. He was good, kind. Died in a barn collapse 4 years ago." Wyatt nodded, his hands never pausing. "I wasn't much of a husband," he said after a while. "She deserved better than me. I always thought I'd make it up to her." Caroline turned her head slightly. "You're making it up now." He met her gaze then, holding it longer than usual. "I don't know how to be anything but broken," he whispered. "Then be broken here," she said. "We've got room for that." That night it rained for the first time in weeks. The roof held, the baby slept, and Wyatt, after weeks of sleeping by the hearth, took a blanket and lay near Colt's cradle instead. Not to protect, just to be near him. Caroline watched from her bedroom doorway, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something growing, something steady, slow, and maybe, just maybe, something worth fighting for. The town of Dry Creek had a long memory. It remembered wagon wheels breaking in spring mud. It remembered who paid their debts and who didn't. And now, it remembered Wyatt Cooper showing up with a dying baby in his arms. At first, they only whispered about it at the Mercantile. Ran off after his wife died. Came back with a baby skin and bone. Living out at the Whitlow place, you hear? But time, like a horse worked hard, settles under good hands. Caroline came into town more now, with Wyatt sometimes watching Colt back at the ranch. She sold eggs and butter. She bought coffee and sugar. And folks noticed. Not just because Wyatt had cleaned up and mended his coat, but because Caroline, once the quiet widow who kept to herself, was smiling again. Even the preacher's wife leaned in one Sunday and whispered, "He's looking at you like a man sees the rest of his life." Caroline chuckled softly. "I think he's just grateful I know how to bake bread." But she knew there was more than gratitude growing in Wyatt's eyes. One hot morning, she brought Colt into town for a doctor's look. Just routine. Wyatt insisted on going, holding the child all the way in the wagon, like he was carrying the most fragile thing in the world. At the clinic, old Dr. Talbot examined the boy and nodded. "Strong lungs, good color, you did right." Caroline smiled. "We did right." Wyatt glanced over, quiet, proud, and nodded. "We did." But not everyone welcomed the change. One man, Jed Carver, who used to work with Wyatt on cattle drives, cornered him behind the general store that afternoon. "You think showing up with a baby and a pair of soft eyes makes people forget the drunk you were?" Wyatt didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for forgetting. I'm just asking for a chance." Jed spat in the dirt. "Just don't drag her down with you." That night, Wyatt didn't eat much. He sat outside, whittling wood in silence. Caroline brought him stew in a tin bowl. "Someone remind you of who you were today?" He nodded. She set the bowl down beside him and sat, arms crossed. "I knew who you were when you walked up my porch carrying that child. I also know who you've been every day since." Wyatt swallowed hard. "And who is that?" She met his eyes. "A man who stayed." Inside, Colt gurgled in his sleep. Outside, two people sat under a prairie sky that remembered its storms, but offered stars just the same. The first frost came early that year. It painted silver on the railings and glazed the tips of the tall grass that swayed behind Caroline's barn. Wyatt chopped extra wood. Caroline brought out the quilt her mother made by hand, and little Colt, now sturdy on his knees, had taken to crawling toward the kitchen smell of biscuits like a puppy chasing scent. The house felt full, not just with warmth, but with something neither of them dared name. One evening, as Caroline stitched a tear in Wyatt's shirt by firelight, he looked up from the floor where Colt was attempting to chew on a wooden spoon. "You ever think about it?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Think about what?" "Us, this, what we're doing here." She kept stitching, slow and even, every day. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was expectant. "You think it's foolish?" he asked. "I think I've lived through worse things than love," she said quietly, "and I'm not afraid of better ones." Later that night, Wyatt stood by the cradle watching Colt sleep. Caroline stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely. "He called me Ma today," she whispered. Wyatt turned slowly. His voice cracked. "He did?" She nodded. "Just once, then he drooled on my apron." Wyatt chuckled, low and soft, a sound like spring thunder too far to fear. "He's lucky," he said. He'll never remember starving. And we'll never forget, she replied. The next morning, Wyatt saddled the horse before sunrise. I'll be back by dusk, he said. Sheriff offered me some hauling work. Figured I'd earn the nails we need for the chicken coop. Caroline nodded. Be careful. You still ride like you owe the wind money. Wyatt smirked. I'll slow down if you tell me this place needs me. She didn't smile. She just stepped forward, placed a hand to his chest, and said, It does. The kiss that followed wasn't hurried. It wasn't born of passion or loneliness. It was the kind of kiss people waited for their whole lives and often missed because they settled too early. As the sun lit the horizon in gold, Wyatt rode off, and Caroline stood in the doorway, holding Colt, a child who had been saved, a woman who had been alone, and a man who had finally found his place. The morning air carried the crisp scent of pine and the low whisper of a coming storm. Wyatt rode toward town with a calm heart and a purpose in his chest. There was peace in his life now, one he never thought he deserved. But the world had a cruel way of testing good men when they began to believe again. He didn't notice the rider until he heard the second set of hooves trailing his. He slowed. The rider did too. Turning slightly in the saddle, Wyatt squinted. It wasn't someone from Dry Creek. Too clean. Too still. The man didn't wave, didn't speak, just shadowed him for a mile and then turned back toward the southern hills. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Caroline was stirring apple preserves when Colt started crying. Not from hunger, but from a sharp, startled wail that cut through the room like a blade. She rushed to him. Nothing was wrong. No fever, no harm. Just his little eyes, wide and unsettled, staring toward the back window. She turned slowly. Nothing there. But the unease in her bones didn't pass. By late afternoon, Wyatt arrived back in town. The sheriff greeted him near the stable. Good to see you still breathing, Cooper. Wyatt chuckled. You say that like you expected something else. The sheriff leaned against a post. Well, stranger rode through this morning. Asked about you, said he was just passing through. But he wasn't asking casual questions. Wyatt's jaw tightened. Did he give a name? Nope, but he had eastern boots, soft hands, and eyes like a man used to having his way. Back home, Caroline paced the kitchen. The air felt different, still but not quiet, like something was holding its breath. When Wyatt returned just before dusk, he caught her outside feeding the chickens. But her eyes were scanning the tree line. He dismounted, kissed her forehead, and whispered, We may have company soon. She didn't ask for details. She just said, Then we keep the lanterns low. That night, after Colt had fallen asleep against Caroline's shoulder, Wyatt finally spoke. There's a man from my past. He doesn't forget, doesn't forgive. Caroline nodded slowly. You think he's here for you? I think men like him don't travel without a reason. Caroline looked down at Colt, then back at Wyatt. Then he's not walking away with yours. The storm broke around midnight. Thunder in the sky and something else coming in the dark. The rain came sideways, sharp, slashing against the windows and rattling the wood-paneled walls. Caroline sat by the cradle with Colt sleeping soundly, swaddled tight in quilts. The lantern was dimmed low. Every creak in the house seemed louder than the last. Wyatt stood by the door, shotgun in hand. Not for hunting, not for warning, but for one single purpose. Protecting everything he finally had. Just after midnight, a shape appeared beyond the gate. Not a ghost, not a shadow. A man in a long coat, rain dripping from a wide-brimmed hat, leading a black horse. He moved like someone who knew he was being watched, but didn't care. Wyatt stepped onto the porch before the man could knock. The wind tore through the silence between them. You're a hard man to find, Cooper, the stranger said. Wyatt didn't blink. Didn't know you were still looking, Roland. Inside, Caroline gently picked up Colt and moved to the back room, ears tuned, heart tight. She knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. I came for what you owe me, Roland said, and I won't leave without it. I don't owe you anything, Wyatt replied. Not after what you did. You ran, Roland growled. Left me to bleed in that canyon. I saved your life dragging you out, Wyatt snapped. You just didn't like how the cards turned after. Roland took a slow step forward. I lost everything. Wyatt nodded. And you came here to take what I built. A pause. No, Roland said. I came to burn it down. The first shot rang out like thunder inside thunder, but it didn't come from Wyatt. Caroline stood in the open doorway behind him, Colt still in her arms, and a rifle cradled in her free hand. You fire one more bullet, she said coldly, and I swear this town will bury you where you stand. Roland turned, surprised but not shaken. Is that so? He sneered. Caroline didn't flinch. You're not the first man I've buried, but you might be the one I don't regret. A long silence. Roland stared at her, then back at Wyatt. His mouth twitched, something between a smirk and surrender. This ain't over, he said, stepping back into the rain. Wyatt didn't lower his gun. It is for tonight. The stranger disappeared into the dark. The storm passed, but something had changed. Not just between Wyatt and the past, but between Wyatt and Caroline. They had faced fire before. But tonight, they stood as something more than protectors. They stood as a family. The storm had long passed, but its memory lingered like smoke in the rafters. Morning light broke over the hills, warm and golden. Colt cooed softly from the corner cradle, safe in the arms of peace. For now. Wyatt hadn't slept much, pacing quietly through the night, checking windows, scanning the horizon. But the house stood. So did they. In the kitchen, Caroline moved with a calm, confident grace. She brewed coffee, placed bread on the fire-warmed stove, and waited for Wyatt to sit. When he finally did, it was in silence, heavy but not hopeless. "You think he'll be back?" she asked softly. Wyatt nodded. "A man like Roland doesn't just disappear. He circles like a buzzard, waits for the wounded." Caroline passed him a plate and sat across from him. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice clear. "He may come, but I know what I'm standing for now." Wyatt looked at her, really looked. "You could have run last night. You should have. For Colt." She raised a brow. "I don't run for my family." It was the first time either of them had said it out loud. Family. Not just the boy, not just a moment of shared crisis, but something deeper, something earned. Later that day, they rode into town together for supplies. Heads turned. People whispered. No one missed the rifle strapped to Caroline's saddle or the way she held herself taller, fiercer. At the general store, Miss Agnes leaned over and whispered to her, "You got fire in you, girl. Always did. Just needed the wind to show it." Outside the saloon, Wyatt tied the horses and turned toward her. "I never thought I'd find peace in a woman who nearly shot a man on my porch." Caroline smirked. "I didn't nearly shoot him." Wyatt laughed for the first time in days. "You really staying?" he asked. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his chest. "I didn't feed your son because I pitied you. I did it because I knew. The moment I held him, I belonged. That night, as the prairie wind danced through the open windows, Wyatt tucked Colt into bed and returned to the porch where Caroline waited. Stars stretched wide and brilliant overhead. "I ain't never had a home," he said. "Not really." She reached for his hand. "Now you do." And in the hush of that western night, love took root. Not in the fire of passion, but in the quiet strength of two hearts who had known what it meant to be alone, and who chose never to be again. The sun rose pink and gold over the plains, but Wyatt felt the weight of something heavier riding in the wind. He'd known it since before dawn, when the horses grew restless in the barn, and a hawk circled too long above the ridge. Trouble never sent a telegram in the west. It arrived on horseback, cloaked in dust and silence. And today, it was coming for them. Caroline was in the garden, trimming early spring shoots with Colt strapped to her back. She noticed Wyatt on the porch, staring out toward the horizon, hands clenched at his sides. "Is it him?" she asked, not needing to name who. Wyatt nodded. "Riders, 2, maybe 3, keeping low in the draw like snakes in grass." She didn't hesitate. "We can't outrun them." "Didn't plan to." Inside, Wyatt loaded shells. Caroline packed food and tucked Colt into a worn satchel lined with linen, soft as clouds. Her hands didn't shake. She'd made her decision long ago. This family was hers. The riders didn't knock. They came in fast, circling the cabin like wolves, dust kicking up in angry spirals. One had a rifle slung low. Another wore a red scarf across his face. The third rode a black horse, Roland's. Wyatt stepped down from the porch, his shotgun at his side, but not raised. "You had your warning," he called. "And you had your time," Roland shouted back. "Now I take what's mine. This land ain't yours. This house, this child, this woman, none of it ever was." Roland's eyes flashed. "Then I'll burn it all." A sharp sound cracked the tension, the report of a rifle, but not Wyatt's. Caroline stood in the doorway, steady and tall, aiming straight between Roland's men. "You'll leave," she said, "or I'll put you in the ground you came crawling over." Roland laughed, a cruel grating sound, but the man beside him shifted, uneasy. "This ain't what I signed on for," he muttered, pulling back on the reins. "Coward," Roland hissed. But the man didn't stop, nor did the second rider, who turned and followed. It was Roland alone now. He dismounted slowly, gun drawn. "Last chance," Wyatt said, stepping forward. "You always had a way with last chances." And then the gunfire was fast, brutal, loud. But it wasn't Wyatt who shot first. It was Caroline. The bullet struck Roland's hand, spinning the revolver into the dirt. Wyatt was on him in seconds, pinning him down, rage simmering like coals under his skin. "You come near her again," Wyatt growled, "and I'll finish what she started." Roland spat blood but said nothing. When it was over, Wyatt let him crawl to his horse, clutching his wounded hand. He rode off in silence, smaller than he'd ever seemed. Back inside, Colt had slept through it all. Caroline leaned her head against Wyatt's chest, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You think he's gone for good?" she whispered. Wyatt held her close. "If he isn't," he said, "he'll find out this house doesn't burn." That night, as wind brushed gently against the walls and stars blinked awake above the plains, Caroline whispered in the dark, "You didn't just bring us here to be safe. You brought us home." Spring lingered longer that year, as if the land itself was holding its breath, watching the little family who had survived the storm, the fire, the past. The days were warmer now, softer. The porch had new wood from the sawmill. The garden bloomed fuller than it ever had before. And Wyatt had a new habit, one he didn't speak of, but that Caroline noticed. Every evening after supper, once Colt had been kissed goodnight and the lanterns dimmed, Wyatt would sit at the kitchen table with a piece of paper, quiet, thoughtful. One night she asked, "What is it you keep writing?" He hesitated. Then he turned the paper toward her. "It was a land deed." "You're putting it in my name?" she whispered, stunned. "Our name," he corrected gently. "I figure it's time to stop running and start claiming. We built this together." Tears burned her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sudden swell of everything she'd once thought she'd lost. Trust, belonging, a future. "And Colt?" she asked, voice trembling. Wyatt reached into the drawer and pulled out another paper, a legal adoption form signed and sealed. "I don't just want you," he said. "I want him too, if you'll have me." She laughed and cried all at once, then leaned across the table and kissed him with everything that had waited so long to be free. A month later, the church bell rang through the hills. It was a small gathering, just the preacher, Miss Agnes with tears in her eyes, and a few neighbors from town who had watched this family rise from broken pieces. Caroline wore a soft blue dress. Colt clapped through most of the vows. Wyatt forgot part of what he was supposed to say, but no one cared. When the preacher asked if she took this man to be hers, Caroline didn't hesitate. "I already did," she said. Later that evening, under a sky streaked with gold and lavender, Wyatt stood behind her on the porch. Colt was asleep in her arms, his breath slow and peaceful. "You know," she whispered, "I think he knew. Even back then when you knocked on my door, he knew I was supposed to be his mother." Wyatt wrapped his arms around them both. "And I knew," he said, voice low and sure, "you were meant to be mine." The prairie wind sighed softly through the grass. The old shadows were gone, and in their place stood something stronger than fear, more lasting than loss. A home, a family, a forever.